guys, it's Katie from S.Media, and today I wanted to talk to you about EQ. So obviously everyone knows what IQ is. It's the way that we measure human intelligence, but what is EQ? So EQ, the term EQ was first used in the 1960s by psychologists to map out the specific traits that combine to create EQ, or emotional intelligence. So these 5 traits are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. But what was also found is that EQ is not necessarily just a purely innate quality, it can actually be learned and developed as well. So what we want to talk to you about today is how certain brands actually mirror very human qualities, the ones that I've just listed, self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills, how these brands actually mirror these human qualities and how they measure, so how high actually is their emotional intelligence or their EQ.
Hi guys, it's Flo from S.Media, and I want to talk about the top EQ brands of 2020. So the list is quite long and I'll just read it for you now. So there's Google, Microsoft, Samsung, Adidas, Nike, Coca-Cola, Amazon, Nivea, Visa, Apple, Panasonic, Philips, Netflix, Kellogg's, Mercedes-Benz, IKEA, McDonald's, Oreo, MasterCard and Nespresso. So this study was conducted in the early months of 2020, and it had 10,000 participants from all across the world. So from countries like the US, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, Australia and China, and countries like that. And basically they had to rate these brands off of the 5 qualities of EQ, which are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy and social skills. So what you'll notice about this list is that the majority of them are technology brands. So the top 2 are Google and Microsoft, and obviously they're very heavily technology based. But that comes as no surprise, seeing as the majority of 2020 was spent indoors due to the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of people relied and turned to virtual contact, online shopping and streaming.
Hi, I'm Chris. Now the brand EQ study highlighted 2 different archetypes of brands, these being classic and experienced brands. The first one, classic brands, were sort of clustered industries that were automotive, food and drink or finance based. These industries obviously sold a lot on their self-awareness and the emotions that surrounded their brand message and their brand meaning, and they had a lot of context around sort of who they were, which they could sell on, and they were obviously more favoured by groups in older age categories as they've grown up with these brands, but they failed to sort of sell on being reactive and impulsive to the needs and the wants of the customer. A typical example that they used was Mercedes, who had tried to incorporate autonomous driving into their new line of cars and invest in this technology, but this wasn't received by the customers particularly well, as their study, well, their sort of the EQ study illuminated that their gap between their empathy and their self-awareness was nearly 3 times that of other brands, which is obviously, a big problem. The other type of brands that they archetyped were experienced brands. Now these were mainly in the technology and retail sector, and obviously they were very geared around the customer experience, and they use a lot of emotional intelligence gathered from data, because obviously they're gathering a lot of primary data, so they could really hone in on what the customer wanted, both now but also what they wanted in the future. But obviously with the amount of data they're gathering, the question of self-regulation and honesty was a big one that the study raised. And although sort of it's in the person's eye now and a lot of people are catering to it, in the future this might increase, and obviously with the news of a lot of social media giants being clamped down on, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. But that's not just to say that classic brands have nothing to answer for. Obviously their lack of impulsiveness and responsiveness to the market has shown some negativity around how their brands are received, so it's definitely something they can learn from classic experienced brands even.
In 1984, Billy Joel did not mention the rock and roller Cola Wars for nothing, and there has long been rivalry between these 2 brands, but which one ranks with the highest brand EQ. In all 5 areas, Coca-Cola did in fact rank higher in terms of brand EQ, but it's no surprise since the fact that they have been around for much longer than Pepsi. How has consistency made sure that Coca-Cola has the strongest brand EQ compared to Pepsi? Let's take a look at one of their campaigns. Coca-Cola's Share a Coke With campaign actually started off in Australia, and soon enough, because of the success, it went global. This meant that Coca-Cola were able to connect with audiences with one campaign on a global level, meaning that their entire campaign was consistent but also emotionally connecting with their target audience, as everyone was able to get a bottle with their own name on. That is a great example of how brand EQ and consistency has played a part in their overall global campaign.
Now, EQ stands for emotionally intelligent. So this report looks at the top 20 emotionally intelligent brands of last year. Now, I'm going to look at 2 brands in particular, a rivalry as well. Nike versus Adidas. Now, Nike versus Adidas have been a sports brand rivalry for many years, and with last year being known as the year of home shopping, streaming, virtual contact because of what's been going on, because of what was going on, many brands have had to adapt, and many brands did adapt. But it's interesting to see how Nike and Adidas adapted and who came out on top within their markets across the globe. Now, Nike has dominated in the English-speaking countries, which is no surprise because of the American roots, and has also dominated Japan, whereas Adidas has dominated continental Europe and China. Now, I want to point out some of the factors as to why Nike has been creeping up on Adidas, because Adidas remains as the top brand out of the 2 in terms of emotional intelligence. Adidas comes out on top across multiple different categories of scores, whereas Nike comes pretty close. But Nike has definitely closed the gap over the last 2 years, and last year in particular was an interesting one. One of the reasons being, a key factor of Nike's emotional intelligence and how it appealed to audiences is its sub-brand Air Jordan, which is based off NBA star, NBA legend Michael Jordan, and he had a Netflix documentary series released early last year called The Last Dance, and The Last Dance was a massive success. It appealed to a wider range of audiences, and it brought in new fans of Nike and new fans of the Air Jordan brand as well, using the legendary status of Michael Jordan himself, and how Nike have launched a massive library of clothing items and different sports gear based around the Air Jordan mark. Just goes to show how much of a success this has been. The other factor is that Nike now sponsor Liverpool, and Liverpool Football Club are now at the peak of their powers. It just goes to show the strides that Nike have made in terms of closing that gap with Adidas, and they've done it really well, and they've adapted the best out of the 2 over the last 2 years, in particular last year, that's for sure. Whereas Adidas, they've kind of had a steady year last year, but Adidas, they are basically still ahead because of the great legacy that Adidas have created throughout the years. We've had multiple marketing campaigns throughout the years that looks at the fan engagement and looks at the fan interest in the game and the fans' point of view. No doubt in the coming years that this rivalry is going to be closer than ever before, and it's going to be one that we should keep our eyes on, that's for sure.
I'm going to talk about 2 underperforming EQ companies. Number 1, Facebook. In a list of the top 50, they came out number 41. And at the bottom was Uber. Now, 2 brands we know really well, yet they're very successful companies. In fact, they're doing better during the pandemic than most other companies. So they are the rule breakers when it comes to high EQ. So do you need to have high EQ? The answer is it's certainly better if you do. But if you don't, does that mean you're out of it? No, absolutely it doesn't. I would definitely strive for having a high EQ though, because your odds are going to be in your favor.
One of the things that's really close to my heart is emotions and empathy within advertising. And as you all know, we're a specialist YouTube agency, and it's a great platform in order to build your brand's emotions and empathy with its customer base. It's a really authentic platform. There's a couple of really good reports come out recently from one from the big network agencies around emotional intelligence. And a lot of that is talking about things like self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. I've just got it in front of the camera here. What's really, really interesting, that whilst brands deliver on lots of things in terms of motivating their customers, they've got self-awareness, they've got really good social skills, it's no surprise that they've got quite a low score when it comes to self-awareness, as in how much they hack off their customers in terms of customer service and the empathy with the customers and understanding the customers. What is really interesting on these stats is that empathy is the same score. It's a really low score. It's the same as self-regulation. So if you think about a lot of the tech brands, they're not that great at self-regulating in many respects, but empathy's down there on the same score. People see brands actually as not really understanding or talking to them in a way that they want to be talked to. Now, I've done a lot of talks about this recently, about ensuring that your propositions are not just value-led or sales-led, but actually emotional and have an empathy with the customers, because it's clearly needed. So whilst this report's quite shocking, I'm personally quite pleased about it, because it's something that I bang on about all the time. So please, consider the empathy and the understanding of your customers. It's so important to your marketing, particularly going into 2021 after what's gone on this year.